Welcome to this class. My name is Onyx David Opati. I'll be taking you through EDF 411, Comparative Education. It's yet another semester where we're going to be studying comparative education together. I hope this becomes a mediation of knowledge where I learn from you as much as you learn from me. Now, I have an abridged course outline which spells out clearly the broad topics you're supposed to be covering this semester in this course. We'll talk about comparative education as a discipline. It's a field of study in social sciences, so we'll talk about comparative education as a discipline. And then we'll also talk about the development of comparative education. It's developed over time, from the ancient times to the phase of travelers' tales and so on and so forth. And then we will look at how exactly do you study comparative education, what we call the methodology or approaches to comparative education. As a field of study, it's not without challenges. So we'll also look at challenges in development of comparative education. And then we'll look at sample systems of education for the sake of comparisons. We cannot be talking about comparative education without looking at specific systems which can then be compared with each other to see what we can learn from them. And then topic 6 will be contemporary issues in education. What are the issues in education now? The issues in education now play a significant role in shaping our education system. And class, just so you know, these 6 broad topics will form the basis for our quizzes. You will do 6 quizzes from topic 1 to topic 6, and each quiz will carry 5 marks. Yes, 5 marks, so that we avoid this whole story of cramming for cuts. There'll be no designed cuts for specific periods, but instead, after every broad topic, you will have a quiz that carries 5 marks. Cumulatively, by the time we are on topic 6, you will have done 6 quizzes that will constitute your continuous assessment test. Now, that said, let's dive into it. So, what is comparative education? Class, have you ever wondered why schools in Kenya look so different from those in other countries, say Finland, Japan, or South Africa, even Uganda? Or why some countries emphasize exams while others focus on creativity and teamwork and soft skills? That's exactly what comparative education is all about. Well, so comparative education is a study of how different countries organize, how different countries manage and experience education, and what we can learn from each other. Think of it as a global classroom of sorts where we compare ideas, we compare successes, and we compare challenges. Then we ask ourselves, what can we borrow from this or that system of education? What should we adapt? What can we do better? As you learn later, not everything that's working in other countries can work in your own country. We talk about context. It might be a very good system, but working in a totally different context. For instance, and you will hear me quote a lot of Finland, which has one of the best education systems in the world. It will surprise you to know that they don't even do exams. Why do we emphasize on exams when the best system in the world doesn't have exams? That is ironical. Does it mean that they are lazy? Why is it working for them? But then can we borrow what they do and plant it in Kenya wholesome? Or should we take what they do with a pinch of salt because context differ a great deal? Now, why compare? Why compare? See, you want to learn new ideas. You're not doing comparison for the sake of comparison. Some countries have what you would call global best practices, in terms of class sizes, teacher training, and the economics of it. How does the government fund it? And while you are comparing all these factors that shape how we conduct our education, it's for the sole purpose of seeing what works and what doesn't. And like I've already said, not everything that works in one context will work in all contexts. And the sole aim of doing this is to just improve our own education system. We do not compare for the sake of comparison. We want to see what works where and how does it work. Why does it work well in one context and not in the other? And then borrow selectively what we think can be beneficial to our own system. Now, when we are doing this comparative study, comparative education then become more than just looking at schools, because it digs deeper into the culture, into the politics, into the economics of a country, even into the history of a country, and it shows us how these forces, the politics, the culture, the economics, how these forces shape education systems. You see, by looking beyond our borders, we get fresh perspectives of how to improve learning at home, while appreciating the diversity of approaches worldwide. It's not like ours not working perfectly well. We're just saying there is always somebody who is better than us. So why not borrow from the best? So you look at the bigger picture. Yeah? There's a bigger picture in all of this. In short, comparative education opens our eyes to the fact that there's no single way to educate. There are lessons everywhere. We just have to be curious enough and be able to compare these differences. There's always something new to learn from others. So education is global. Let's learn from each other. So different scholars have made an attempt to define what comparative education would be. But curiously, there is not a universally acceptable definition of what comparative education is. But even then, many scholars have come up with a criteria that you can use to come up with what can be acceptable to many, serving as the definition of comparative education. Now, despite comparative education not having a universally accepted definition, most scholars have agreed that a good one will talk about what we study, that is the content. And then it will also include how we study it, not just what we study, but how, the how of it, how do we study it? And then the why of it, why do we study comparative education? So think of comparative education as a passport that let us explore different educational systems, to compare ideas and to learn from the works of others, and what works best for our context, and so on and so forth. So how have different scholars defined comparative education? Let's dive in. We begin by Hans Nicholas in 1958. Nicholas basically said that comparative education is a step-by-step study of different and often contrasting educational systems with a view of understanding their differences and similarities. So Hans Nicholas basically said that comparative education is like going step by step, studying different education systems. Sometimes they look totally different, sometimes they look quite similar. The whole point is to understand those differences and similarities. In other words, it's like looking at both the contrast and the common ground. We get a clearer picture of what works and what doesn't. and why it works or why it doesn't. Now, the next scholar I want to look at is Owen Epstein, who in 1995 said, comparative education is a field of study that applies historical, philosophical, and social science theories and methodologies to international problems in education. Epstein described comparative education as a field where we use history, we use philosophy and social sciences, methods to tackle international problems in education. And what does that really mean? When we face challenges in education, we don't just look at it from one angle or in one country. We draw on different disciplines and compare how other places are handling similar issues. For example, take free primary education. In Kenya, it was introduced in 2003, but the country struggled a lot with overcrowded classrooms and shortages of teachers because that policy shift did not match the infrastructural development and manpower development at the time. Now we look at Uganda, which had introduced free primary education earlier in 1997 to be precise. They had similar challenges but also developed different coping strategies. So by comparing the two, we learn valuable lessons, not just about what worked, but also about what to avoid. That's the real power of comparative education, because it helps us to see education problems in context and learn from the global classroom, and all in a view of adopting what you would call global best practice. Our next scholar is Vernon Mallinson. Now, in 1975, Vernon Mallinson defined comparative education as the analytical study of the factors that influence the development of education in historical and comparative perspective to identify the principles upon which solutions to educational problems are based. Now, he looks at many factors. He has pointed out social, cultural factors, political factors, historical factors, and all these factors put together shape how education develops in different places and at different times. In simple terms, it's about asking what makes education in one country look the way it does. Then, comparing that with others to see patterns and principles. And what was the big idea here? To figure out what actually works and then use those insights to solve real problems in education. For example, why did Japan rebuild its education system so quickly after World War II? And why do Scandinavian countries consistently rank high in equality and learning outcomes? Comparing these contexts help us discover guiding principles we can apply elsewhere. So comparative education equals to studying the why behind education system so we can build better ones. We can improve what we have. Fraser and Brickman in 1968 defined comparative education as the analytical study of the factors that influence the development of education in historical and comparative perspectives to identify the principles upon which solutions to educational problems are based. Now, this view says comparative education is really about analyzing different educational systems, but not in isolation. We look at the bigger picture, the social, the political, the economic, the cultural, and even ideological factors that shape them. Now, in everyday language, it's like saying, why does education in country A look so different from country B? Then digging deeper into the forces like the political situation, like the culture, how is the economy doing, so the economic factors. Now, that explains both the differences and the surprising similarities. In short, Comparative education is about connecting the dots between schools and society across countries. So we can understand how and why education takes the forms it does. We look at Beredy. Beredy's view in 1964 was that, simply put, comparative education is the analytical study of foreign education system. You see, for him was straight to the point. Comparative education is the analytical study of foreign education system. Now, let's put that in our own words. Imagine you were studying abroad, say in Norway or in Japan or in Germany. You'd probably notice straight away that their schools or universities don't run the same way as ours. So Beredy's point is that comparative education is about looking closely at those foreign, quote unquote, foreign systems, analyzing how they are structured, and then asking ourselves, what's different? What's similar? What can we learn from them? Do they emphasize practical skills or do they emphasize passing exams? In other words, it's about being educational explorers by examining how others do it so we can better understand and improve our own systems. Again, like I've said before, we don't do comparisons for the sake of it, but with a view that we might learn something new that might then improve our own system. So the residual outcome of any comparison would be to try and fix the problems that our system might be facing. Let's look at Isaac Kandel. What is Isaac Kandel's definition of comparative education? He says that comparative education seeks to analyze and compare the forces which make for differences between national systems of education. Remember, we've already said, when you say systems, we are looking at education from the national stage. So Kandel looked at comparative education in terms of the forces that shape education systems. He said the goal is to analyze and compare the difference. You know, you compare different forces that make national education systems so different from one another. Think about it this way. Why is schooling in Kenya not the same as in France or, say, India or the USA? Kandel would say it's because of things like history, things like politics, things like culture, things like economics, and even the value system of that society. So all those factors is what Kandel has termed as forces, the forces that push education in one direction or another. So comparative education, according to Kandel, is like, detective work. We dig into these forces, compare them across countries, and try to figure out why education looks the way it does in each of these places that we are studying. But there's another interesting definition by Harold Noah and Max Eckstein. What do they say? Noah and Eckstein saw comparative education as the sitting right at the crossroad of social sciences, education and, of course, national study. So comparative education, according to these two, is sitting right at the crossroads of social sciences, education, and, of course, national study. So it is multidisciplinary, tapping into social sciences, tapping into education, tapping into national studies. So it's multidisciplinary. In simple terms, the two are saying that this field is not just about schools. It's also about how education connects with society, connects with politics, connects with culture and economics across different countries. Imagine it is in a meeting point where sociology, history, economics, even education all come together, and then we use that mix of all those areas to study and compare what's happening in different nations. So in a nutshell, for these two,
comparative education is a truly interdisciplinary project. It's not locked in one box of, say, education. It borrows very heavily, you know, it borrows tools and ideas from everywhere to help us understand education in global context. We are global. The metaphor here is global. Global is when you are thinking global but acting local. We want to fix our system, but we are looking elsewhere to see what inspires us. Another scholar is Peter Ragat. He says, or he defines comparative education as the cross-national study of general propositions about relationships between education and society and within educational relationships. You see, Ragat took comparative education as a step further. He took it a step further and he defined it as the cross-national study of big ideas or general propositions about how education and society connect, and also how things connect within education itself. You know, put simply, he wasn't only interested in comparing schools across countries, but he was also asking the bigger questions. How does education shape society? And how does society shape education in return? And how do different parts of the education system relate to each other? You know, looking at that symbiosis, how one feeds into the other. So think of Ragat's view as zooming out to see the whole picture. Education, you know, not just as a classroom or exams, you know, but as something deeply tied to the way societies live, the way societies grow, the way societies change. So deeply intertwined with other factors in society. But perhaps one person does us justice and kind of just summarizes all these ideas into one single paragraph. And he is Gakunga. In 2008, he says, comparative education is a discipline through which one makes comparisons of education systems across national boundaries by examining in detail the structure, curriculum, administration, financing, and participation with the aim of understanding the factors and forces that account for the differences and similarities in the systems of education with the sole purpose of instituting education reforms. Now, Gakunga ties it all together by saying that comparative education is basically a discipline that compares education systems across different countries. But it's not just surface level comparing. He points out that we look closely at things like the structure of schools, the curriculum, how education is managed and financed, and who actually participates, or what we'll call the participation rates of this system. Now, the real goal, according to him, is to understand the forces and factors. You know, these forces and factors like social, political factors, cultural factors, economic or socioeconomic factors, all these try to explain the differences and similarities in how education works across nations. And here's the key part. The ultimate purpose of all these comparisons is not just knowledge for its own sake. It's about using what we learn to reform and improve education system. Class, today we've looked at the various definitions of comparative education by different scholars. So let's look at the big picture of what comparative education actually entails. Comparative education doesn't, have one single definition. You learn that. Different scholars see it from different angles, and that's okay. But when we put their voices together, a clear picture starts to emerge. For instance, Hans Nichols, 1958, saw it's a careful step-by-step study of different education systems to spot similarities and difference. Upstein, 1995, went a little broader and said that it's a field that borrows from history, philosophy, and the social sciences to tackle international problems in education. Mallinson stressed the importance of analyzing the forces. These forces could be historical, could be cultural, could be political, and these forces shape education and how they help us solve problems. Beredi is the one who kept it very simple and says it's the analytical study of foreign education systems. Simple. You are comparing Kenya and Uganda. You're comparing, sub-Saharan African countries. Kandel, on the other hand, reminded us to look at the forces behind differences between national systems, while Noah and Eckstein placed comparative education at the intersection of social sciences, education, and cross-national study, making it a truly, truly interdisciplinary field of study. While Peter Agat zoomed out even more, saying it's about understanding the relationships between education and society, and within education itself. And finally, the Kunga brings all of these threads together and defines comparative education as a systematic comparison of education system across nations, examining their structure, their curriculum, their financing, their administration, with the ultimate goal of understanding the forces behind them and using that knowledge to reform education for the better. So in short, comparative education is like being an educational explorer. And you know what an explorer does? Explores. So traveling across systems, digging into the why behind them, and using those insights to make education stronger everywhere. Thank you very much for this lecture. Thank you for your cooperation, and I hope to see you in the next class.